The blade was already at Clayton Boone's throat when he decided, against every instinct screaming in his blood, to smile. He would never be able to explain it afterward, not truly, not even to himself. He was 26 years old, soaked to the waist in well water and mud, standing over a wooden hatch with a terrified boy hidden beneath it, and the woman who meant to kill him had eyes the color of struck flint and a curved orc blade already drawing a thin red line beneath his jaw. Smart men did not smile at death. Smart men begged or ran or froze. But Clayton had never been accused of being the smartest man in Miller's draw, only the strongest backed. And so when the orc woman leaned in close enough that he could feel the heat coming off her skin, close enough to see the fine dust of battle caked in the war paint across her cheekbones, something in him simply gave up being afraid and let itself be amazed instead. She was, without question, the most magnificent thing he had ever seen. Taller than him by a full head, built with the long, coiled power of a war horse rather than the softness of any woman he had known, she wore fitted leathers the color of scorched earth, laced tight across a broad chest, and cinched at a narrow waist with a wide belt of studded hide, her forearms wrapped in bands of dark leather that left her hands bare for killing. Twin curved tusks framed a mouth currently pulled into a snarl of pure battle fury, and yet even snarling she was beautiful in a way that made his chest ache strangely, some old animal part of him recognizing danger and desire in the same breath. Around them, Miller's draw was burning at the edges. The Ashfang warband had come down out of the borderland hills at dawn, screaming and swift, and the little frontier camp had no wall worth the name, only a scatter of half-built cabins and the deep new well that Clayton had spent 3 weeks digging with his own 2 hands. He had sent the settlers running for the tree line the moment the horn sounded. He should have run with them. Instead, he had remembered with a cold drop in his stomach that Nell Farrow's boy had been playing near the well shaft not an hour before, and so he had gone back, found the boy trembling in the dark half-dug hole, and put his own body between the child and the warband's deadliest blade. He knew what she was. Everyone along the border knew the stories of the woman the Ashfang called Murak Mudborn, the blade that never missed, the one who led every charge and always came back whole while other warriors came back in pieces or did not come back at all. He had heard men swear over tavern tables that she had killed more soldiers than the pox. He had not expected, when he finally saw her, that her eyes would be so alive, so present, so clearly a person's eyes and not a monster's. "Move," she said in accented but perfectly clear common tongue, her blade steady at his throat. "Or die where you stand, well digger." He knew his trade marked him, the calluses on his palms, the rope burns, the mud caking his boots. She had read him in one glance. He should have been more frightened by that. Instead, he found himself grinning, a real grin, helpless and a little giddy with terror, because there was a boy sobbing silently against his leg and a beautiful, terrible woman about to end his life, and the whole absurd shape of it struck him, in that final moment, as almost funny. "Ma'am," he said, voice cracking only a little, "I've dug 40 feet of well in 3 weeks with a busted shovel and a mule that hates me. I am not moving for anybody today." For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Smoke drifted between them. Somewhere behind her, a warrior shouted something in the orcish tongue, urging her to finish it and move on to richer plunder. Murak Mudborn did not look away from him. Her blade did not waver. And then, slowly, disbelievingly, the corner of her mouth twitched, not quite a smile, more the ghost of one fighting its way up through years of iron discipline, and Clayton Boone, fool that he was, smiled wider at her in return, honest and unguarded, the smile of a man who had already decided he would rather die smiling at something beautiful than screaming at something cruel. She sheathed the blade. It happened so fast he almost missed it, the curved steel sliding home into the scabbard at her hip with a sound like a held breath finally released. Behind her, a warrior barked a protest, and she rounded on him with a fury that made the man flinch back 3 full steps, snapping something sharp in her own language that needed no translation. Then she turned back to Clayton, studied him a moment longer with an expression he could not name, equal parts fury at herself and something softer buried beneath it, and said only, "Take the boy and go, before I change my mind twice in one morning." He did not need telling twice. He scooped Nelfero's son up under one arm and ran, and behind him he heard the warband withdraw as swiftly as it had come, taking grain and livestock but leaving the cabin standing and every soul in Miller's Draw alive, which the old-timers later swore was not how an Ashfang raid was supposed to end. Clayton never told anyone the whole truth of it, only that the warband's blade had looked at him and let him live. He did not tell them about the smile, or the strange hollow ache that stayed in his chest for months afterward, the sense that he had touched something enormous and been let go by it gently, like a stone set back down instead of thrown. He did not see Murak Mudbourne again for 3 years. By the time autumn came round the third time since that morning at Miller's Draw, Clayton Boone had made his way north and west, following the trade of his hands to a windswept spit of land called Gullhaven, a fishing settlement of some 200 souls perched at the very edge of a rocky peninsula the locals simply called the Reach. Twice a day the sea rose up and swallowed the narrow causeway of packed shell and silt that was the only road connecting Gullhaven to the mainland, cutting the whole place off in a churn of gray water, and twice a day the tide fell back and let the world in again. It was a hard, salt-scoured place, all wind and gull cry and the smell of drying nets, and Clayton had come there because the well the old settlement drew from had gone brackish, and a place that could not keep sweet water could not keep people. He was, by then, the only well digger for 2 days' ride in any direction, and Gullhaven had come to depend on his strong back the way a body depends on its heart quietly, without much thought, until the day it stopped. He had sunk 3 new wells into the rocky ground of the Reach in as many years, coaxed sweet water up out of stone that by all rights should have held none, and the folk of Gullhaven had grown fond of him in their reserved, weather-beaten way, inviting him to suppers, saving him the good cuts of fish, even trying once or twice to match him with this widow or that fisherman's daughter. He was polite about it. He was polite about everything. He was also, if anyone had asked him honestly, achingly alone, a man who had built his whole life around a trade that kept his hands busy and his heart carefully unoccupied, because some part of him was still standing over a half-dug well with a blade at his throat, waiting to see if a smile would work twice. He told himself he did not think of her often. This was a lie he told well enough to almost believe, right up until the evening the hunters rode into Gullhaven asking after an escaped orc slave, and something in his chest went cold and certain before he even heard the description. But that evening was still some days off. First there was Murak. She had spent 3 years learning what it was to be property. After Miller's Draw, the Ashfang warband's fortunes had turned. A rival human legion, better armed and worse bound by honor than the borderland militias the Ashfang usually fought, had caught the warband strung out and thin in the Thistlewood Valley not 2 months after that strange, merciful morning, and had broken it utterly. Murak remembered little of the battle itself beyond the noise and the blood, and the moment a net weighted with iron had dropped over her from a hidden rise, tangling her sword arm, and after that only chains, wagons, the long stinking dark of a slaver's hold, and the auction blocks of 3 different border towns where men who had never swung a blade in their lives priced her like livestock, and spoke of her strength as though it were a saleable feature of a plow horse. She had been sold as a war prize, a curiosity, a trophy for men who wanted to say they had broken the deadliest blade of the Ashfang and kept her leashed at their table. She had not broken. She had simply waited, with the patience of a warrior who had once held still for an entire night in freezing mud to win an ambush, for the moment her captors grew careless enough to give her one. That moment came on a rain-lashed road 3 weeks past, in the custody of a slaver and bounty broker named Garrick Voss, a lean, smiling man with a collector's eye and a cruelty he wore as comfortably as his coat. Voss had chained his newest prize by the wrists to the rail of his wagon, confident in iron, and in the 3 armed riders who flanked him, and had not accounted for the fact that Murak Mudbourne had spent a decade learning exactly how much force a human wristlock could bear before the bone beneath it gave first. She broke her own thumb to slip the manacle, took a dagger from the nearest guard's belt before he understood what was happening, and left 2 of Voss's riders bleeding in the mud before she vanished into the tree line with nothing but that stolen blade, a stolen cloak, and the iron will that had kept her alive through worse than this. Voss did not let his merchandise walk away easily. He put hounds on her trail within the hour, and riders behind the hounds, and word ahead of the riders to every border town and coastal village that a reward waited for the orc woman's return, dead or, preferably for the sake of his prophet, alive. She ran for 11 days. She ran along riverbeds to break her scent, slept in trees, ate what she could steal or kill with her bare hands, and every day the hounds found her trail again a little faster than the day before. By the 11th day her wounds had wounds, her stolen boots had worn through at the sole, and she had begun, for the first time since she was a child learning to hold a blade, to consider that she might simply be caught again or killed, and that either outcome might come as something close to a relief. It was on that 11th day, half delirious with exhaustion and blood loss from an arrow that had grazed her ribs 2 days before, that she came over a wind-scoured rise and saw, laid out below her in the gray evening light, a long low spit of rock and grass reaching out into a churning sea, and at the base of it a narrow road of packed silt already beginning to vanish beneath a rising, glittering tide. She did not know the name of the place. She knew only that hounds could not swim well, and that a road the sea swallowed twice a day was a road that might swallow her pursuers with it. And so, she ran the last mile of her strength down the slope and out onto the narrowing causeway with the water already lapping cold and insistent at her ankles, and she did not look back to see whether Voss's riders reached the rise behind her before the tide closed the door. She made it perhaps 3/4 of the way across before her legs simply stopped obeying her, and she went down hard onto wet stone with the sea rising fast around her, and the last of her strength gone out of her like water from a cracked jug. Clayton Boone was hauling up the last bucket of shale from his newest well shaft, 300 yards inland from the causeway, when Tam Ferris came sprinting up the lane, hollering that there was a body washing in on the tide flats, and something in the boy's voice made Clayton drop the bucket rope and run before he had even fully decided to. He was not the first to reach her. A knot of Gullhaven folk had already gathered at the edge of the flats by the time he arrived, keeping a wary distance because even collapsed and soaked and bleeding, there was no mistaking the green-gray skin, the tusks, the sheer coiled size of the woman lying half in the surf. Someone had a hay fork. Someone else was shouting for the reeve. Clayton pushed through them without quite registering that he was doing it, some old certainty pulling him forward faster than his own good sense, and when he dropped to his knees beside her in the freezing water and turned her face up out of the foam, his heart simply stopped in his chest. 3 years had put new scars on her, a fresh notch through one eyebrow, the gauntness of hard use where there had once been a warrior's healthy strength, but he would have known that face anywhere in the world. He would have known it in the dark. He had carried the memory of it for 3 years like a coal banked under ash, and here it was, alive, breathing, bleeding out onto a strange shore and ocean of luck away from where he had last seen her. "Murak," he said, and his voice cracked on the shape of a name he had never once said aloud to another living soul. Her eyes opened. Flint gray, glassy with pain and exhaustion, they found his face and held there, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all while the tide crept higher around his knees, and the gathered folk of Gullhaven murmured behind him in confusion and alarm. "Well, Digger," she rasped, and something that was almost a laugh broke loose from her, raw and disbelieving. "Of all the shores in the world. Somebody get the reeve," a woman's voice called out behind him, sharp with fear. "That's a warband orc, that's one of theirs, we can't just—" "She's hurt," Clayton said, not turning around, already sliding an arm beneath Murak's shoulders. "She's hurt and the tide's coming in and I am not leaving her to drown on my well-watered shore. Somebody bring a litter, or by God I'll carry her myself." He did carry her himself in the end, hauling her up out of the rising surf with his back screaming in protest, her weight nearly buckling his knees, while 200 pounds of muscle and old orc leather draped half-conscious over his shoulders, and the whole of Gullhaven watched him do it with expressions ranging from horror to naked astonishment. It was not graceful. It was not the sort of rescue told in songs. But he got her up onto dry grass above the tide line, laid her down as gently as his shaking arms allowed, and knelt over her with his shirt already off and pressed hard against the arrow wound in her side. And when she looked up at him through pain-glazed eyes and managed, somehow, to smile back at him, thin and exhausted and utterly unafraid, he felt the whole world tilt quietly on its axis and settle into a new and better shape. "You always were a fool for smiling at the wrong moment," she murmured, before the darkness took her under. They gave her the old net shed at the edge of the flats, mostly because Clayton refused to leave her lying out in the open, and partly because Reeve Thomas Wren, a cautious, gray-bearded man who had run Gullhaven's affairs for 2 decades, was more curious than afraid, and curiosity bought her 3 days' grace before any decision had to be made about what a settlement was supposed to do with a wounded, wanted orc washed up on its shore. Clayton spent those 3 days at her side, more than his own good sense probably should have allowed. He cleaned the arrow wound and stitched it clumsily with a fisherman's needle and gut line, boiled willow bark for the fever that came and went, and sat up long into the night listening to her breathe, half convinced each rasping inhale might be her last. She was strong, though, stronger than any human patient he had ever tended, and by the 3rd morning her fever had broken and her eyes had come back sharp and clear and fixed on him with an intensity that made his ears go hot. "You are still doing that," she said, watching him change the dressing at her side with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear. "Doing what?" "Smiling at an armed woman who once held a blade to your throat." She shifted, testing the wound with a wince, and settled back against the folded nets that served as her bedding. She wore now only a borrowed linen shirt of his, far too small across her shoulders, and her own leather leggings dried and cleaned as best he could manage. Her war harness and bodice hung to dry on a peg nearby, waiting for her strength to return along with her right to wear a warrior's leathers again. "You should be more careful, well, Digger. It worked on me once. You should not assume it will not get you killed by someone else entirely." "I'll take my chances," he said. "Seems to be working out for me so far." She laughed, a real laugh this time, rough with disuse, and the sound of it did something dangerous to his chest. "You remember my name, after 3 years and one very short, very bloody morning." "I remember everything about that morning," he admitted, quieter now, not looking up from the bandage. "I thought about you more than I probably should have, for a woman I met for the space of about a minute while she was deciding whether to kill me." "And what did you decide in all that thinking?" He did look up then, and found her watching him with an openness that had nothing of the war band's deadliest blade left in it, only a woman, tired and healing and looking at him like he was something worth the looking. "I decided," he said slowly, "that I'd never forgive myself if I spent the rest of my life wondering what would have happened if I'd found the nerve to go looking for you. And then I never did go looking because I didn't know your warband's name or your camp or anything but the shape of your face, and I figured that was that. Some things you don't get twice. And yet," Murak said softly, "here I am. Washed up on your shore like the sea itself decided to finish what that fool smile started 3 years ago." "Here you are," he agreed, and neither of them said anything else for a long moment, the silence between them charged with everything neither was yet brave enough to say outright. It was Murak who broke it, because she had never in her life been a woman who waited for someone else to make the first move when she had already decided what she wanted. She reached out with her good arm, curled 2 fingers under his chin, and tipped his face up to hers with a slow, deliberate strength that made his breath catch. "For 3 years," she said, "I told myself the well-digger's smile meant nothing, that I sheathed my blade because I was tired of killing that morning, nothing more. I have told myself many convenient lies, Clayton Boone. I am tired of telling myself that one." "Say my name again," he breathed, and she did, low and warm, and then she kissed him. It was not gentle, not at first. 3 years of denial and 11 days of running, and the sheer relief of being alive and found, and wanted all crashing together in the press of her mouth against his. And Clayton made a small helpless sound against her lips and kissed her back with every bit of longing he had spent 3 years pretending he did not carry. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathing hard, she pressed her forehead to his and let out a shaky laugh. "This is a very poor idea," she said. "A hunted slave and a well-digger. Your reeve is already deciding whether to hand me back to the men chasing me for a purse of coin. This will end badly for one or both of us." "Maybe," Clayton said, brushing a thumb along her jaw, marveling that he was allowed to touch her at all. "But I already told you. I'm not moving for anybody. Wasn't going to move for a blade at my throat 3 years ago, and I'm sure as hell not moving now." Word had reached Gullhaven of the reward for an escaped war prize before Murak was even fully healed, carried in by a passing fish trader who had heard it shouted at 3 towns down the coast. And by the time Garrick Voss himself rode his lathered horse down the last stretch of mainland road toward the causeway, the whole settlement already knew, in the tight-lipped way of small places, that the strange orc woman sheltering in the net shed was worth good coin to someone. Voss timed his arrival for low tide, when the causeway lay open and passable, and he brought with him 4 riders, a wagon fitted with an iron cage, and a smile that Clayton disliked on sight, oily and confident in the particular way of men who had never once had to fight for anything they wanted. "I'm told," Voss said, reining up in the muddy square before the Reeves house with half of Gullhaven gathering to watch, "that you have found something of mine. A green-skinned woman, dangerous, valuable, and legally my property under the war prize statutes of the Southern Crown. I would hate for good, honest fishing folk to find themselves harboring stolen goods." "She's not goods," Clayton said, stepping forward before he had quite decided to, close enough to Voss's horse that the animal shied. Behind him he was aware of Reeve Wren's uneasy silence, of the townsfolk's murmuring, some frightened, some already calculating what a share of that reward might buy a family through the winter. "She's a person, and she came here half-drowned and bleeding, and I mean to see her mended before anybody talks about handing her to anyone." Voss's smile did not waver, but something colder moved behind his eyes. "How touching! The well-digger has grown fond of his monster." He raised his voice for the benefit of the gathered crowd. "Good people of Gullhaven, I offer 50 silver crowns for the safe return of my property, no questions asked, no trouble made for any household here. Or," and here his voice hardened, "I return with the magistrate's writ and the crown's soldiers and take her by force, and burn the goodwill of this little spit of mud to the waterline in the process. Your choice." The murmuring behind Clayton grew uglier, fear doing what fear always did, curdling neighbor against neighbor, and he felt the ground shifting dangerously beneath the whole fragile arrangement he had built around Murak's recovery. He was still searching for words when the net shed door opened behind him and Murak Mudbourne walked out to meet her hunter herself, upright and steady on her own 2 feet for the first time in days, dressed once more in her own cleaned and mended war leathers, tusks bared, eyes flat and dangerous, every inch the deadliest blade of the Ashfang warband the stories had always promised. The crowd went dead silent. Garrick Voss, she said, and his horse shied again at the sound of her voice, low and carrying. You broke my thumb to bind me in your wagon and called it a fair price for my life. I do not belong to you. I never did. I only allowed you the illusion of it because a chain looks the same whether the one wearing it is planning her escape or not. Voss's composure cracked just slightly. You're a runaway slave, orc, plain and simple, and every soul here knows the law. I know a border law older than your writs, Murak said, and now her gaze swept the crowd, deliberate, commanding, the voice of a woman who had once held a warband's obedience with nothing but presence and will. Trial by arms. Any freeborn creature under threat of bondage may challenge the claim upon their body in single combat, witnessed fairly, the outcome binding on both. It is older than your crown statutes, and it is still written into the border treaties your own kings signed after the last war. I invoke it, here, now, before every witness on this spit of land. Reeve Wren, gray and startled, cleared his throat. She speaks true, he admitted slowly into the crowd's stunned quiet. The old treaty clauses still stand unrepealed. I have read them myself. If he refuses a lawful challenge witnessed by the settlement, his claim is forfeit under the old law. Voss's eyes flicked from Murak's steady, blade-ready stance to the gathered crowd, to the tide already beginning its slow crawl back up the flats behind them, and Clayton watched the calculation happen behind the slaver's eyes, the sudden understanding that refusing now, in front of 200 witnesses, would cost him more than any coin could recover. Pride or greed or simple miscalculation of his own skill made the decision for him. Fine, Voss snarled, swinging down from his horse and drawing a long, well-kept sword from its scabbard. I have killed better than you, orc, chained and starved as you've been these past weeks. Let's finish this before the tide finishes it for us. They fought on the flats at the edge of the causeway. The crowd of Gullhaven ringed loosely around them at a wary distance. The incoming tide already lapping cold and silver at the pact, silt only a stone's throw away. A rising clock neither fighter could ignore. Voss was fast and well-trained, a professional's economy of motion, but Murak Mudbourne had been forged in a decade of real war, not dueling salons, and even weeks of chains and days of starvation had not burned the killing instinct out of her. She moved like something poured rather than stepped, her stolen dagger traded for a proper blade Clayton had thrust into her hands from Voss's own wagon, racked the moment the challenge was accepted, and she met the slaver's first flurry of strikes with an economy that made the watching crowd gasp. Clayton stood at the front of the crowd, every muscle in his body wound tight, hands aching with the useless need to do something, anything. And when Voss's third rider tried to circle wide and put an arrow into Murak's unguarded back, it was Clayton who saw the bow rise and threw himself bodily into the man before the shot could loose, taking them both down into the mud in a tangle of limbs, while the crowd erupted into shouting. He came up with a bloodied lip, and the rider's own bow snapped in half beneath his knee, and he did not have time to feel proud of himself before he had to scramble back out of the churn of the fight, because Murak had heard the commotion, seen him go down, and for one heart-stopping instant her focus had wavered from her true opponent toward him instead. Watch her, not me. Clayton bellowed, and something in his voice, raw with fear not for himself but for her, snapped Murak's attention back where it belonged just as Voss lunged. She turned his lunge aside with a movement almost lazy in its precision, stepped inside his reach, and drove her borrowed blade through the gap beneath his raised sword arm, not deep, not a killing blow, but enough that Voss staggered back with a scream and dropped his sword into the rising water at his feet, clutching his side, beaten and disarmed before the whole watching settlement of Gullhaven. The tide had reached their ankles by then, cold and rising fast, and Murak Mudbourne stood over her fallen challenger with her blade at his throat exactly as she had once stood over Clayton Boone in a half-dug well at Miller's Draw, and the whole crowd held its breath to see whether history would repeat itself in blood. She did not kill him. Under the old law, she said, loud enough to carry to every straining ear on the flats, your claim is forfeit, and my freedom stands witnessed. Take your remaining men and your empty cage, Garrick Voss, and if I see your face on this coast again, the tide will not be the only thing that swallows you whole." Voss's men, cowed by the display and the loss of their leader's authority, gathered their wounded and fled back up the causeway with the sea already closing the road behind them in a churning silver line. And the crowd of Gullhaven, 200 fishermen and net menders and children with their mouths hanging open, erupted into a roar of noise that Clayton would swear for the rest of his life he could still hear echoing off the cliffs whenever he closed his eyes. And then, before he had fully processed that the fight was over, that she was safe, that she had won, Murak Mudbourne crossed the muddy flats to where he stood dripping and bloodied and grinning like a fool, took his face in both her hands, and kissed him full and deep and utterly without shame in front of every man, woman, and child of Gullhaven, tide water swirling around both their boots, her blade still red in her free hand, her tusks grazing his lip. 3 years and 11 days of running and wanting, finally spent in a single, unrepentant, public claiming that would be talked about on that windswept spit of land for the rest of its existence. The crowd's roar redoubled, half of it scandalized gasping, half of it, to Clayton's lasting astonishment, actual cheering, and somewhere in the noise he heard old Widow Ashton declaring to anyone who would listen that she had never in 60 years of living seen the like, and heard little Tam Ferris shouting something about the orc lady kissing the well-digger that would follow Clayton good-naturedly around the settlement for months to come. When they finally broke apart, both of them soaked and laughing and utterly unbothered by their audience, Murak pressed her forehead to his the same way she had in the net shed and said, low enough that it was only for him, "I told you it was a poor idea, well-digger." "Worst idea I ever heard," Clayton agreed and kissed her again. It did not end all at once. The fear and suspicion Gullhaven had carried toward orc-kind for as long as anyone could remember the border wars, but it began to crack that very afternoon on the tide flats, and it kept cracking in the days that followed as Murak Mudbourne, rather than vanishing back into the wilds now that her freedom stood witnessed and legal, chose instead to stay. She mended nets alongside the fisherfolk with hands strong enough to snap a man's forearm, and gentle enough to untangle the finest thread without a single knot pulled wrong. She hauled stone for Clayton's well-digging with an ease that halved his working time and drew grudging respect from men who had spent years being wary of anything green-skinned. She sat at Reeve Wren's long table for supper within the fortnight, stiff and watchful at first, and by month's end trading dry, cutting jokes with the Reeve's own wife that left the older woman laughing until she wheezed. Not everyone came around easily. There were mutters still, from a hard core of Gullhaven folk who had lost kin to orc raids in the old border wars and could not so easily unlearn a lifetime's fear. And twice in that first month, someone scrawled an ugly word across the netshed door in charcoal, and once a fisherman named Corwin Hale refused outright to sell Murak fish at his stall, loud enough that half the market square heard him do it. Clayton stood beside her through every one of those small cruelties, quiet and steady, never raising his voice, simply present, an unmovable fact at her shoulder the same way he had once refused to move from a half-dug well shaft. And slowly, the ugliness lost its grip on the settlement's heart, worn away by the sight of the deadliest blade in the old Ashfang warband hauling stone and mending nets and laughing, actually laughing, at a well-digger's terrible jokes. It was on a night some 6 weeks after the duel on the flats, with autumn's first real chill creeping into the sea wind, and the netshed long since abandoned in favor of the small stone cottage Clayton had built for himself at the edge of his latest well site, that the last of the careful distance between them finally, fully dissolved. They sat together on the cottage's single step, sharing a bowl of Murak's own rough-cooked fish stew, watching the last light bleed out of the western sky over the water, and Murak turned the empty bowl over in her large hands, studying it with an intensity that made Clayton smile. "You're thinking too hard about a stew bowl," he observed. "I am thinking," she said slowly, "about a custom of my people that I have not spoken of to you, because I was not certain until tonight whether I had the courage to ask it of a human man." She set the bowl aside and turned to face him fully, and in the dying light her eyes held none of the warband's iron, only a rare and careful vulnerability. Among the Ashfang, when a warrior chooses a mate, she does not ask permission of chieftains or elders. She marks him herself with her own hand, so that any who see it know he is claimed and chosen and protected, and any who would harm him answer to her blade first. It is not a light thing. It cannot be undone. "Is that what you're offering me?" Clayton asked, his heart suddenly hammering. "It is what I am asking of you," Murak corrected, and for the first time since he had known her, the deadliest blade in the old warband looked almost shy. "I have never asked it of anyone. I did not think 3 years ago in a half-dug well that I would ever ask it of a well-digger with mud on his boots and a fool's smile on his face. But I am asking now, Clayton Boone, will you be marked as mine?" He did not answer with words at first. He reached out and took her hand, the same hand that had once held a blade to his throat and later held a blade steady against a slaver's, and pressed his lips to her calloused knuckles with a tenderness that made her breath catch. "I've been yours since the moment you sheathed that blade," he said. "Mark me, I'm not going anywhere." What passed between them after that was not for anyone else's eyes, only the last of the sunset and the sound of the sea below the cottage, her hand steady and careful, where it traced the old orc right into the skin over his heart with a fine obsidian point, and a pigment made from crushed ashberry, a mark that would fade in color over years but never truly vanish. And when it was done, she gathered him against her with a fierceness that spoke of 3 years of denied want finally given its answer. And the two of them stayed wrapped together on that narrow cottage step long after the stars had come out over the reach, murmuring low and unhurried things to each other that neither would repeat. Afterward to another living soul, content simply to be found and chosen and no longer alone. The season turned. Storms came in off the sea and rattled the cottage shutters, and Clayton dug 2 more wells before the ground froze too hard for digging, and Murak spent the growing dark months of early winter teaching a handful of Gullhaven's younger folk, boys and girls both, how to hold a blade properly, not for war, but for the plain sense of knowing they could defend the little spit of land they called home if ever the need arose again. The mark over Clayton's heart had settled into a faint, permanent green-black tracery by the time the first hard frost came, and Gullhaven had settled, in its own slow and grudging way, into simply calling her Murak, no longer the orc, no longer the war prize, no longer anything but the well-digger's woman, which around that windswept spit of land had become, without anyone quite deciding it formally, a title carrying its own particular respect. Garrick Voss did not return, though word drifted up the coast some months later that he had abandoned the slaving trade entirely after word of his humiliation on the Gullhaven Flats spread through every border market from the Reach to the Southern Crown roads, no buyer willing to trust a slaver who had lost a war prize in a witnessed duel to the very woman he claimed to own. Whatever became of him afterward, neither Clayton nor Murak much cared to learn. Their world had grown smaller and richer than any of that, narrowed down to a stone cottage above a tide-swept causeway, a well-digger's steady trade, and a bond neither the sea nor any slaver's chain had managed to break. A full season after the duel on the flats, on a bright, wind-scoured morning in early spring, with new grass just beginning to green the Reach and the causeway gleaming wet and open at low tide, Clayton Boone stood at the mouth of his newest well, watching Murak Mudbourne haul a bucket of stone up the shaft with the same easy strength that had once terrified an entire border camp, and found himself struck, as he was struck nearly every morning now, by the sheer improbable fact of his own happiness. "You are staring again, well-digger," she said, without turning around, setting the bucket down with a solid thud. "Can't help it," he admitted, crossing to her side, slipping an arm around her waist with the easy familiarity of a season's worth of mornings just like this one. Woman washes up on my shore half-drowned, turns my whole quiet life inside out, marks me for her own in front of half the settlement, and now she expects me not to stare. I expect nothing of the kind, Murex said, turning in his arms with the particular smile she wore now only for him, all the old iron softened into something warm and certain. I expect you to stare exactly as much as you like, Clayton Boone. I intend to do the same to you for a very long while yet. Above them, gulls wheeled and cried over the glittering morning tide, the causeway lying open and unguarded between Gull Haven and the wider world, and neither of them felt the smallest need to cross it. They had already found, on this narrow, windswept spit of rock and grass, everything either of them had spent a lifetime of loneliness and war searching for without knowing its name. And when Clayton Boone leaned down and kissed the deadliest blade the old Ashfang warband had ever raised, slow and unhurried in the bright spring light, with the whole of Gullhaven going easily about its morning business around them, no one so much as looked up to stare. It was, by then, simply how the story of the well-digger and his orc woman had always been meant to end, chosen and kept, and no longer alone.